Pansophers Podcast, a podcast on Rosicrucianism, Hermeticism, and the teachings of the Western esoteric tradition, where adepts, practitioners, researchers share their views.
Hello, friends and listeners, and welcome to the first episode of this new brand, the Pansophers podcast. And I'm very glad you joined us here, be it on the Pansophers channels for that podcast, be it on my Thoth Hermes channel, wherever you are listening. Welcome and thank you for being here. Thank you for also supporting this podcast. And well, I hope you will enjoy what we'll have to do here. Those of you who are used or have been used to the Thoth Hermes podcast so far will not be very surprised about this format with 3 pieces of music each time, a lengthy interview, interrupted also once by music with my guest. And that guest here today is Tobias Churton. Tobias, who has been with me several times already on a podcast, and we've talked about many different things. And the thing is, with Toby or Tobias, you can really talk about many different things. I called him, I also said that in the announcement of that podcast on Facebook and Twitter, I called him the polymath of esotericism and occultism, because he really is so knowledgeable. You will hear that. You ask him a question and he can answer in any direction you want him to, and he does. And he really will teach you a lot and many, many interesting things. Also, with always a great link into our time here. It's not just history or the past that he's talking about, but really about life and what esotericism, Hermeticism, and of course Rosicrucianism means for us here and now. And that's why we're here, because today's subject with Tobias Churton is a book he has written a few years back already, but on a subject that visibly has always, I wouldn't say haunted him, but always been with him. And he will explain to us also right in the beginning of that interview why that is the case. That subject is Rosicrucianism, of course, one of the core subject of Pansophers, pansophers.com, which you should absolutely visit. Pansophers.com, that big blog website where you find many, many interesting articles on all kinds of different topics around esotericism, but mostly and mainly also on Rosicrucianism, and in the near future also a blog and analysis of Hermeticism. And I have the pleasure and honor to be the host of the podcast for Pansophers. And, I'm really looking forward to nice and many episodes. We're going to have 2 episodes a month, though every second and fourth Sunday. So this is episode 1 once again. And when I said that Tobias was a polymath, that goes beyond speaking and writing. He's also a musician. I mean, many of those occultists, esotericists are musicians, but he also writes music, not only interprets it, but he also writes music like some others as well, of course. And that's great, because today, for the music that I play in this episode, it will, of course, be his music. And before we play that first piece and then go into the interview, there is a slightly different intro to the interview that I usually do. Normally, I would now play you a piece of music and then I'll tell you a bit about the interview to come, and then we'll start it. But today, I won't do that. Today, I already told you what it's going to be about, and we play now that first piece of music composed and recorded by Tobias. And then you'll hear his voice with a poem that is on the first page of his book, Invisibles, which gave the title to today's episode. And it's a very important poem, and I would advise you listen to it carefully. Enjoy it read by the writer himself who did it, but he did it many, many years ago, and it has become very important for him. He is going to tell you all about it in the beginning of that interview. So without further ado, let's now play the first piece of music by Tobias Churton. And this piece is a waltz. Well, quite a good fit for an Austrian who is presenting you that podcast, isn't it? Well, that is called Mysterious Waltz. Mysterious Waltz by Tobias Churton. And after that really beautiful poem by Tobias Churton. And then the interview with Tobias Churton. Enjoy.
I find this rock and inscribe upon it the image of my heart. But here, amid the redressed stones of ancient yesterdays, I found the source and plan of a quest, another man to whom I look when no one dares. The sky draws its cozy sheet above our heads, and western minarets, grounded in their mass, huddled in their mass, remain an image for my heart, permanent in their watchfulness. A cloistered, ingrown abscess upon commercial man, a monk who keeps his prayers and tolls his bell, never ceasing nor forgetting the harmony in plan. The sky above has laid his hands, declaring, separate you shall be. Not to wander down the red brick tiles of alleyways, nor consort with the fading stones corruptible, for with their flags, decrees, and bars, forever incompatible. I trod the rounded, tiny debris of past and new construction, and wondered who could build this basilica of eternity, turning back as one the few who shun modernity. They've tried their best to deck you with that faded flower advertisement, and put their fancy hat on well-proportioned battlement. Yet beneath the stumbling, invading sneakers, the refugees from Dole, I sense the cries of anguish from your weathered, battered soul. We're now at peace in leaving the erosion of the crowd. Only wind and elements stiller, the progress of the shroud.
Here comes the interview.
Well, we just heard the voice of Tobias Churton, and, well, here he is. Tobias, hello, welcome on the Pansophers podcast on this first episode, and it's great to have you. Hello.
It's very good to be here, Rudolf, and that you're not a reindeer.
Well, I might be in 2 months, actually, but well, we met 4 times on the Thoth Hermes podcast, and I was really surprised today when I checked, and it was almost by the day, 3 years back that we last did a talk, and it's about time that we repeat that. And I'm very glad that you opened this new brand of Pansophers podcast here, and the poem you just wrote actually opens the book, The Invisibles. It's called, about Rosicrucianism. We get into that in a moment, but maybe tell us a bit more. It says you wrote that in Carcassonne when you were there, so quite a mythical place as well. What inspired you? What brought you to that poem? What was the...
Very good question. It was part of my personal spiritual adventures of when I was in my late teens. In 1979, the end of my first year at Oxford, I was mountain climbing the Alps at Chamonix and onto the Swiss border, over the Swiss border into Swiss. I was with a friend, and I told him I've got to go somewhere, and I took off on my own on the train, and I found myself in Lyon first of all, and then I got a train to Carcassonne, which I wanted to visit because I'd heard about this, and there's something very strange about in the Pyrenees that attracted me. Obviously, this whole thing about the Cathars, and the Saunière story had literally just been revealed on BBC Chronicle.
Wow.
Michael Bajan and Richard Lee were the researchers. And I'd seen one of those episodes called The Priest, the Painter, and the Devil. And I knew it concerned me at some level, and I wanted to know more, but I didn't know where to go. There was no information at that time. I mean, if you go to Languedoc today, there's signs saying Le Pays du Cathar. And all the mystery and magic that I discovered there in my time has gone for me. It's vanished. It's simply because they put signs on everything. When you put a sign on it, you're no longer discovering it. You're being told what you're seeing. Anyway, I went to Carcassonne. I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know what would happen. I was alone. I was just 19 years old. Was I 19 or just under? Yeah, I just 19. And limited funds, alone, with a Greek grammar. I think I was practicing for my days. And I just went there, and I knew I had to write a poem. In those days, I felt if I wrote one poem a year, my existence was justified. Wow. It had to be a poem from the ether. It had to be something truly encapsulating about where I was at that time. It's spiritually, I'd say now. And then I used the language and grammar of esoterica and so forth in those days. I was flying by the seat of my pants, really. I went there, and I stayed in a hotel that was attached to the train station, I remember, which was incredible then. Nobody went to Carcassonne, by the way, this time. Hardly anybody. The only people who were in there were three kinds of people I saw there. One was prostitutes in all the streets at night, and was more. The second thing was the French army, because there was a barracks there, and there were a lot of soldiers. And the third one was Spanish people who were allowed out under Franco. And the best holiday they could get if they lived in northern Spain under Franco was you crossed the border of Perpignan, maybe you went to Carcassonne. A wonderful old lady who'd inherited the hotel from a vicar, a priest, ran this hotel, which had been built in around the First World War, just before the First World War, when they were expecting a big increase in tourism.
Yeah.
Because there was an interest even then, before First World War, in Catholicism and spiritualism. And there were various groups who were going to that area, even then, called Les Polaires, I think was an Italian esoteric group. Anyway, I didn't know all of that till later, but I ended up in this hotel, which was connected with that theory. And it was a great hotel. I mean, it was right from the past. It would be in a movie, you know, it's Lucchino Visconti would have made something of it. But it was full of poor, very poor Spanish tourists. Now I was even more alienated. I mean, I had rudimentary French, reasonable French, and no Spanish at all. But you'd have thought it was a Spanish town, funnily enough.
Really?
The next morning, I walked into the medieval city. I was self-consciously following the route of T.E. Lawrence. That's Lawrence of Arabia, who in 1910 went on a bicycle tour of the south of France, found himself in Carcassonne. That was the other reason I was there. And he'd taken photographs at various points, and I duplicated some of those photographs. I'd still got them.
Okay.
And I went into the city, and I was looking for any book I could find on Cathars or Saunière or anything. Couldn't find it. There was nothing. I'd written to the Syndicat d'Initiative. They denied all knowledge about Saunière, Rennes, Chateau. Didn't know a thing about it. So all I had was the atmosphere of the place. And I went into a cafe in the city around lunchtime, and I sat there, and then this line came to me. I find this rock and inscribe upon it the image of my heart. I knew that I'd found something. This was, Carcassonne itself became to me a kind of philosopher's stone, a lodestone, a symbolic magnet.
Right.
I mean, it was well before anybody had written any books in English about it.
Yeah, and you even have a board game now, which is called Carcassonne, right?
Yeah, but you can't. I mean, the last time I went, and it was overrun with.
Yes. Yeah.
So it was
amazing.
Discover it for myself.
That's great. And there you wrote that. There you sat down and wrote that annual poem.
One of the great. It would be one of the major poems of my life, and it has been. There are certainly lines in that that sum me up perfectly. Not to wander down the red brick tiles of alleyways, nor consort with the stepping stones corruptible, for with their flags, decrees, and bars forever incompatible. The sky above us laid his hands, declaring, separate you shall be. This idea of being ordained to be different. And I remember I called it in my notes at the time, when I was 19, the triumph and the tragedy. It was the discovery of who I am really, but at the same time, it was tragic knowledge because I knew that it would mean that I would always be outside and separated. And that was miserable, because obviously when you're young, especially, you desperately want to belong and find your group and all the rest of it. And it was like a passport to being an individual. A lot of isolation. So it was. I took a photograph of myself at the city walls, which I still have, and you can't believe there's that much stress on a 19-year-old. It's like it wasn't uplifting. It was almost a slap in the face.
And how does it feel 41 years later?
I knew I took the right road, but it's still very it still has a painful.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that with us. Funny enough, 6 years after you, I came first time to Carcassonne. At the time, I lived in Nice, and I was working at the Opera House. If I may just tell that little story as well. And we co-produced an opera production of, famous title, but the opera has never become famous, but the name of the opera is Montségur, sir. Die Council. And it was written by a French composer, Jacques Charpentier, nothing to do with Marc-Antoine, but he was called Jacques Charpentier, a contemporary death. And he was living in Nice. And
incredible.
Yes, and we drove over to Toulouse basically because I was production manager, and he took me to see that production in Toulouse, right? And while we were driving, we were talking about spirituality and Montségur and Carcassonne and everything. And I was 26 then. We have the same age, basically, for those people who listen and don't know whether Toby and I have the same age, exactly, born the same year. And so at age 26, I was discovering all this world, but didn't know a lot about it. And he brought me to Carcassonne, and we stayed there for a couple of hours. And then he drove up to Montségur. We saw the castle from the bottom. We didn't have the time to walk.
Time of year was it?
It was, funny enough, it was October, but it had just snowed in Montségur, which is unusual at that time of year, but you had just a little coverage of snow there. It was mysterious and beautiful at the same time. And that was my discovery of something which, in a different way, but later became very important to myself as well. So it's definitely a magical area, Carcassonne. And I think this story of your poem brings us directly into why we are here today. We're going to talk about a subject that has followed you. I mean, you've written so many books, but this book, Invisibles, that it was called, I think, first, but it's even, I don't know if this was a prequel, but you wrote another book on Rosicrucianism, but more linked also to Hermeticism and Gnosticism a few years before that, right? Which was The Invisible History of, what's it called? The Golden Builders, I think it was called, right? Yeah. And then the Invisibles, and which become re-edited later in another edition, The Invisible History of the Rosicrucians. So this has over years been the topic that was close to you. Can you say us more about that? What attracted you so much to that very subject? Rosicrucianism, Gnosticism, etc.
Oh, let's keep the Rosicrucians big enough.
Yes.
What the attraction? One was always aware from one's first interest in magic that there was a mythology of a brotherhood that transcended history. That's a strong idea. That there's, it all goes back to comment in St. John's Gospel, my kingdom is not of this world. And this kingdom is not indifferent to this world. It interpenetrates with this world. And people who are interested in this notion of divine destiny to the world are not simply interested in escaping it, but in bringing something forth within the world. So you have two kinds of within. You have the kingdom of heaven, which is within you, but is not of this world. And at the same time, you're trying to put something in the seed, in the kernel of the world itself, will realize an unconscious part of the world's experience. And the whole Rosicrucian mythology is based on this idea of the seeding, of planting a sperma, a seed or element of spirit, on the basis that that is a powerful thing that will grow, as Jesus said, like the mustards. You have that, but obviously there's a romantic interpretation of the Rosicrucian Brotherhood, which is also very powerful, which is developed in the 18th century through Masonic and Paramasonic orders. My personal interest in it was because I met a Rosicrucian.
Right.
Actually, I think my first, things come back to, when I was still at school, I remember applying to AMOR.
Oh, right.
Ancient Order.
Yes. Ancient Mystical Order of the Rosicrucian. Yes.
The Spencer Lewis organization was I don't know where I found the information. It must have been on the back of some magazine or something. And I wrote to them when I was about 17, I think. And they sent me I've still got it, little magazine that you can learn.
Sure.
And they claim to be the inheritor of ancient Egyptian wisdom.
Right.
I was
in San Jose, California.
I'm a very skeptical person, and I was skeptical then, and I thought there are too many claims in this magazine, and I didn't know whether to take it forward. But I was interested. And then I got to know Joost Ritman.
Right.
Bibliotheca Philosophica Heretica.
In Amsterdam.
And I got to many trips to Amsterdam in association with his library. Before Dan Branch.
Yeah.
Before Dan Branch. And he was, obsessed with the notion of a real Rosicrucian brotherhood, and that the brothers were returning and things like this. And I was very swept up in that because my romantic nature very much this is all very appealing. The notion that you could join. I mean, the same thing happened to Aleister Crowley when he joined the Order of the Golden Dawn.
Yeah.
He had this feeling of being part of some cosmic process. For a young man, the justification for one's existence is very important. And so that's the Rosicrucian Brotherhood somehow had an answer there. But the more I found out about it, and I was determined to get to the bottom of it, who started it, what is it, et cetera, then a rift started to develop, certainly with Ritman, because he was committed to the mythology of Rosicrucian and was very loath, very unwilling to let that go. And he always tried to interpret every new bit of scientific knowledge about the origin. He wanted to give it a kind of alchemical swing. Anything but to see that it was from the beginning a hoax, a friendly hoax, a nice hoax, not quite on the same level mischief as Orson Welles, the Martians in 1939, but it's not far from it. It was a game. It was playing with the expectations of the time. And the main perpetrator, is perfectly obvious to anyone unless you're committed to the mythology. It's obviously Johann Valentin André, with Tobias S, and some involvement of Christoph Bissold, and the tumult that is going on in Tübingen University between 1604 and into the second decade, on the eve of the 30 Years' War. The war, I was fascinated. I love history, and I found the history of the Rosicrucians as interesting. The mythology is not lost. And I also became deeply attracted to André, Johann Valentin André, as an individual. I think he's one of the most brilliant theologians of all time. I hope one day that's recognized. I find it astonishing that practically none of his books have been translated into English.
Oh, really?
Most of them are in Latin, so they haven't been translated into German either. And I think that's one job that the Bibliotheca Philosophica Hermetica could undertake. But after 1990, Mr. Rittman became rather, how can I say, not very encouraging about England. I don't know if it had to do with Margaret Thatcher's European Union. But I mean, even so, that's a pretty low reason to despise the English language, when in fact he was investing in America in a very big way.
Right.
I'd have thought that was he started translating the book, his Dutch stuff, into German primarily, and decided Germany was good. Which, when you consider the history of Holland in the last century, seems a bit strange to me. Fascination for German, but also it was basically a commitment to Europe, and the English language. That's just one of those things I think about. And I thought, well, who knows this stuff in England? Certainly at that time, nobody in England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, knew anything like as much about it as I did.
You mean about Rosicrucianism in general?
It's a historical fact.
Yeah.
Even my friend Chris McIntosh, the book, The Rosicrucians, first published, I think his first version was around 73, maybe. Yeah, right. A subsequent edition. Yeah. But even he was still very much part of the old tradition of Arthur Edward Waite. But he'd done a lot. He went on when he was doing his PhD through my one of the old tutors I knew, praised Oxford. He did more work on the Masonic side, which was brilliant stuff, and came out through Brill. But nobody, I still regard the Rosicrucian story as, one of the greatest, the greatest story ever told. I think it's one of the greatest stories that never told. I tried to make films about it. I tried to turn it into this form of art or that form of art. I couldn't understand why people didn't see the absolute incredible character of the real story of the Rosicrucians, with Adam Mayer being thrown into the galleys in 16. Yeah, it's just an incredible story.
Well, maybe you could tell us a bit that real story, just the core of it. What for you is the real story?
Well, yeah, it strikes me as amazing. Here's this guy, Johann André, like me, like all of these questing youths with spiritual idealism burning in their soul, go traveling. And André went traveling. He went to Italy. He went to France. Like they all did. John Dee, Giordano Bruno, they all went on these travels. You're trying to find your soul. You're trying to find the daimon or the angel that's going to guard you, or you feel you're being led by it, maybe, but you're being led towards a mystery. You constellate every phenomenon that crosses your mind that suggests this mystery, whether it's Montségur or walking around Florence or whatever it is. And everyone you meet seems to be part of this questing thing. And you're living in a tapestry of a combination of mythology and spiritual idealism. André was one of these people. And in the course of his travels, he develops a very definite attitude towards the world and its duplicity and its misleading character. He's Pilgrim's Progress. And then he meets this extraordinary apocalyptic-minded doctor, Dr. Tobias Hess, a doctor of law, but he also practices medicine to a very large degree and magic, and he's interested in magic at Tübingen. And he sees this man Hess as a kind of perfect Christian, the ideal, a Christian Hercules, I think you call it. How much Hess puts into the farmer, I don't. He's still, we don't know. But he's a kind of living Christian Rosenkreuz, and I think that about Christian Rosenkreuz's body of being found whole and unconsumed is really based on what happened to Hess when he died.
Right.
He found also that there was something remarkable about his corpse and its purity, and he lived the absolute Christian life, even though he had, I think, 7 or 8 children, or lived in a house with a wife, him, and so many dominated by these mothers, and there's all that, and then you've got. Then there's a manuscript in 1610, long before anyone was a farmer fraternity. There's a manuscript circulating at God knows how in the Tyrol. And it's read by a Paracelsian, spiritual, apocalyptic-minded doctor called Hasselmeyer, who's also a notary public to the Archduke Maximilian. And he reads the farmer, and he writes to one of the great Catholic authorities of Austria, "Oh, you've got to help. Let me go in search of this Rosicrucian Brotherhood I read about in this fabulous piece." And of course, Maximilian consults with his Jesuit inquisitor. Like what I know it to me is a Protestant heresy. He's infiltrating dear beloved Catholic Austria from that.
Oh my God!
Lutheran Wittenberg
Heresy.
And you better stop this guy. And poor old Hasselmeyer ends up being an absolute innocent. Clearly a believer in the spiritual church of Paracelsus against the Mauerkirche, the church of the unperceiving. Well, we're on fundamental archetypal trick, looking at the world in terms of church of stone, church of spirit.
Right.
Everyone we're talking about has gone for a church of spirit. Montaigu represents a kind of holocaust of the spirit. So you have that. And then you have this amazing relationship between Hess and out in northern Germany. And
here we are.
von Anhalt's, Ludwig von Anhalt's brother at where? Klutzkau. And he also wanted to know who this Rosicrucian Brotherhood is. It's such an amazing story with secret printing presses and this enormous enthusiasm and awareness that something is boiling, something is happening. There is a kind of transnational movement of the spirit. They're all desperate to see a new reformation, a reformation of the spirit. And we are still today in post-Second World War, Europe and the world. We're all looking for this revelation of the spirit. And we're at the moment there's an interest in such things. What do we find politically in the world? We get the enemy appears. In this case, in the origin of the Rose-Cross Brotherhood, you have the 30 Years' War, a war of such magnitude and destructive force. I couldn't even begin to describe the tragedy of the 30 Years' War. In some ways, still being fought.
In what way?
Well, I think ideologically, between Protestant, Catholic, and the division of Christendom, which has been the disaster
Yeah. Yeah.
And you see that also in the politics of the Ukraine, Russia, and all of these things. The Greek Church came over to Ferrara in the 15th century to try and make a deal with the Roman Catholics, and the Roman Catholics couldn't make a deal with the Greeks. The next thing is the Turks have taken over Constantinople in 1454.
Mm-hmm.
You've never had a serious rapprochement between the Greek Orthodox and the Catholics. We have divided church everywhere, divided church in England, divided church in France. We have the growth of pure secularism, communism, socialism, all the rest of all the isms, all of this stuff. You have Russian Orthodox standing aloof, and all the rest of it. And this is the tragedy, and that's that collapse of Catholicism, of the Catholic vision of a unified church. Such a tragedy. Such a tragedy.
Which the word Catholic itself means, right?
Brought on by itself. I mean, I think the last few popes have been more aware of this than the few popes before them.
Mm-hmm.
I think Pope particularly.
Yeah.
Is aware that the Catholic Church brought this on itself. But I mean, that's history. Today, we're in a terrible situation. We're in a situation in religious terms quite similar to the 7th century AD. I mean, we're being overrun. In fact.
Yeah, in a way, yeah, absolutely.
Now, then let's be clear that the Rosicrucian movement was Gnostic in a certain aspect. There is an aspect of it. The mythology is Gnostic, but essentially it was an attempt to purify religion to its spiritual truths.
I have a couple of questions here, and maybe first, even chronologically, would be second. But you just mentioned our time and all that's still going wrong here today. So Rosicrucianism, in its mythology or in its thought, or what it means actually, in what way does it have its value and its value today, and how should it translate its ideas, its basic ideas, in order to produce something for today, for today's time, for development of our time? Is there anything left in Rosicrucianism that could be valuable? I don't speak about the esoteric side, really about the Rosicrucianism as such, as it was at the...
Well, I was thinking, I remember Chris McIntosh used to work for UNESCO, the educational wing of the United Nations.
Right.
And he used to know the chap who was running it. And he felt that the Rosicrucian vision had been very important to UNESCO.
Okay.
But translated through the works of Comenius, Nicholas Kamensky, who was an early enthusiast for the Fama Fraternitatis, later realized it was fully realized it was a ludibrium, and that he understood that the idea was meant to inspire individuals to do their own thing. And now you say, well, what should Rosicrucianism do today? Is it should inspire individuals to do their own thing. That's what I'd say.
Right.
All sorts of people. I think many artists. I think I write about it in my book on the 60s, the spiritual movement, spiritual meaning of the 60s. All kinds of people are working with the Rosicrucian story, not necessarily altogether consciously, not specifically, but it has become part of the unconscious. I think it's become part of the archetypal world of artistic idealists. Now you can say, well, what can artistic idealists bring to the world? And I'd say only artistic idealists bring anything new into the world, because you can't expect states to do it. They can't do it. They don't want to do it, and they wouldn't know where to start because they have no inspiration, no imagination at all. Why anyone listens to politicians for prognostications about the future is totally beyond me. They have generally speaking, unless they've got an artistic side, or a philosophical side of any depth. They have absolutely nothing to offer in terms of visions of the future. Or what they have is an ability to manipulate your fears and your dark side, which do brilliantly. Or they can always get affected by frightening people.
Yeah.
They're like school teachers. Hit them with a big enough stick and they will move. That's the attitude. So I would say the contribution of the Rosicrucian thing is to inspire individuals to be courageous and see the world as it is, which is the devil's playground.
Right.
Confront it and be courageous about it. And remember that, this life as we live it is only a beginning. That's I know. So the materialists.
Yeah, but I understand what you mean, and I would believe that's true. The other question I had before, why do you think in the Pharma, Christian Rosenkreuz is shown to go to the Middle East, what we call today the Middle East, stays there in a imaginative town, but doesn't exist? So what's that part of it?
What do you mean?
What does that part mean? I mean,
I think Andre was friends with the professor he specialized in Oriental languages and Oriental culture, Christoph Bezold at Salzburg, who still have his papers. And Bezold had written about some of the groups in the Middle East who are of a more mystical bent. And obviously you've got the Ismailis today. Are terribly important. We always hear about Shia and Sunni. We don't hear nearly enough about Sufis and Ismailis who are spiritually quite close at certain points.
Right.
We talk about Islamophobia. Which bit of Islam are we phobic about? Well, we know it's the one that thinks they're right and everyone else is wrong. That, but a banal sense of the depth of the divine activity in the world.
Right.
The whole point about Rosicrucianism, Hermeticism, a responsible gnosis, is you're interested in the depth of God's involvement in the world, and you don't rest until you get to the bottom of it. You're not content with prejudice.
Mind.
Religion really should be in the hands of the, up to it. It's little knowledge is a dangerous thing, as we say in England.
Yeah.
Nowadays we've got an internet thriving on a little knowledge. So why go to these? Well, I think part of that was Andrei saying that these people in the East may know more than all the Catholic Church put them. It should be open to that.
It's kind of hermetic thought for me because of course Hermeticism being said to have generated in that area whenever or whatever, but that's another subject, maybe another mythology. But still, it for me it's a link where Rosicrucianism and Hermeticism really gets together.
Well, you've got to remember that when Andrei's writing, Hermeticism has been quite thoroughly absorbed into mainstream intellectual culture already. They didn't feel they had to go to the East to find it. Hermes Trismegistus is already a kind of set
at his time, yes.
Look at Harvimento in Siena. He's already brought into as a contemporary of Moses and a prophet of Christ, Lactantius. So I don't think they were thinking that Hermeticism comes from the East. What's interesting about the Farmer story is he's going into the Islamic world to find enlightenment.
Yeah, that's true.
That has to do with the stories that were coming that he'd learned from Bezold, that these groups of Arab-speaking sects met together and discussed ideas without prejudice. They were interested in other words, they were interested in science. What is the knowledge? And when he's writing, you've got to remember when he's writing this, poor old Galileo is locked up under house arrest.
Yeah.
So the Inquisition and the Catholic Church did not allow free transport of ideas. In many ways, the farmer is actually, oddly enough, I'd say it's a manifesto for science, but science with the spiritual dimension still there. What we think of science now, because of the 19th century mechanistic philosophy, is that science is divorced from value judgment. Well, when André is talking about the freedom of science, he's talking about access to knowledge. Not one kind of knowledge, not another kind of knowledge, but knowledge. And spiritual knowledge is knowledge. It's knowledge of the essence of things. The essence, not the thing. If you want to measure, if you want to measure or weigh the thing, then you have measuring instruments. But how can you measure values of a moral and spiritual and truly intellectual nature?
Right.
And so it's a plea for not a spiritual science, not a material science, but what I suppose you'd say today, holistic science.
Holistic, yeah.
Holistic, but I mean, holism, all right. I'd say it's about knowledge, and our culture has become, until recently, blind, deaf to spiritual knowledge as being a source of knowledge. And yet we revere Mozart, and we revere opera, and we revere the arts, and all the arts are treated as if art comes from, these alleged geniuses. Well, what does the word genius mean? It's simply the daimon. It's a surgical, spiritual, occult concept. All art is based on magic.
Art is magic, yes.
It's magic, of course it is. And it's one aspect, but it's separated. So I have a friend who's a scientist, always writing to me, trying to understand why art exists. And there's a real problem with it. Look, he knows it's totally compelling. He loves this. He's trying to justify that art should exist. I said, art needs no justification. I'm not sure about yours.
Yeah. Well, tell him to listen to that new Thoth Hermes series on science and occultism. He will be baffled.
Oh, maybe. Yeah, I think the real André is worth knowing, and that's the person I wanted to expose in my in the books.
Okay, now let's take our usual break here and play again some music by Tobias, as I said earlier. And he wrote quite a few pieces of music, and he gave us 3 of them for playing here today. And this next piece is called Creation. After Creation, we will return immediately to the second part of the interview, who is a little bit longer here today, a few minutes longer than you're used to. And at the end of the talk with Tobias, there is his third piece called Gnostics 2022. And as usual, to those of you who are used to listen to the Thoth Hermes podcast, you know that. Please stay on after the last piece of music. I will tell you what's going to happen in 2 weeks and even next week, because I'm also going to tell you what the Thoth Hermes podcast will be about next Sunday. So, program announcements after the third musical piece. But for now, it's Creation, then the interview part 2, and then Gnostics 2022. Enjoy.
You mentioned Comenius a little earlier when we spoke here. And of course, that clicks with the title of the series, the Pansophers podcast, because Pansophia and Comenius are quite related. So the Labyrinth of the World and the Paradise of the Heart, his main work. We mentioned that before we started our talk here today. What does the term Pansophia mean to you, if it does anything, and so where does it relate to Rosicrucianism?
That God's wisdom is present in everything.
Right, but I mean, as a current like Rosicrucianism, what does it mean in that sense?
Well, to me, it's the link of all. It's the link of all forms of knowledge into a coherent, cosmic soul.
Right.
So everything corresponds to everything else, but we don't have a Pansophia. Pansophia is an aim. It's a goal. Because the world is fallen, and man is fallen, and the world of nature is fallen. So what we have are all the fragments of a once great unity. This is the mythology of the Gnosis. And
right,
once you perceive that, all these fragments are broken. Well, we can then, with the effort of our inspiration and ingenuity, try to bring some of these fragments together and share and give an insight into how everything relates to everything else. One of the great problems of modern learning, never mind the fact states have got involved in science to such a degree that nobody can operate scientifically anymore without state interference. What's the case for my ancestors? One of the great problems is specialization. Now, obviously, we have so much knowledge in a general sense that people have to specialize. But those people need to meet together more. We don't have colloquia which introduce diverse forms of knowledge to other diverse forms of knowledge. Most of the colloquia involve people who are relatively in the same or similar field. They end talking to themselves, and it's a very natural thing that you think your worldview is cosmic and covers everything.
And it becomes a monologue-quia then instead of a colloquia, right?
Even worse than that, it becomes a dictatorial monologue as well. But you hear governments say, we have spoken to our advisors. We saw this in the COVID set. You've spoken to our advisors. Well, who are these bloody advisors? They may be specialists in communicable disease, but do they have any knowledge of the impact of their prognostications? Well, to a scientist, everything's simple. You have a problem, you isolate it. So when you're dealing with nations, I mean, the damage of the COVID thing has been far greater than the disease itself could ever have brought.
Oh, I'm sure.
It's profound, and I don't think, I'm utterly convinced that had Putin not been freaked out of his mind, Moscow worrying about mass, mass communicable in Russia, himself being isolated, he might not have come to the extreme points he came to. Anyway, it gave him time to read books about, very biased books about the history of Ukraine, which has been unbelievable. And I'm not trying to make any light of it. What I'm saying is that when you have scientists who are specialists, their little bit of specialism can be incredibly dangerous. I also think about the climatologists and many who we are being constantly dictated to by specialists. I want to hear the wisdom of the whole piece.
Right.
That used to be invested officially in the church because knowledge was of a kind that it could be handled by one authority. The limitation that you could, it was possible in 1200 to know everything that the world knew. You had a big enough room for enough books. And if you were capricious in thought, you could know everything. We're not in that situation now. We're in a Babel, chaos of knowledge, which the internet has only made it that much worse.
Yeah. So if I get you right, Pansophia for you is a term that goes much beyond whatever occultism, spirituality.
Oh, yes.
But it's a global term for knowledge, right?
Yeah, it's saying that there is no aspect of knowledge which is not related to every other piece of knowledge.
Yeah, right.
There aren't really pieces of knowledge. This is for our mental convenience. We think that's a specialism, that's a piece of knowledge. In the reality, it's Pansophia. It's the mind of God.
Mm-hmm.
We only glimpse in fragments.
Yeah.
Even then, depending on our level of inspiration, our being inspirited.
Yeah.
To be inspirited is to be connected to the whole. What we call the poetic genius, which is the power of divine imagination, which rationalism, unfortunately, disregards to its enormous and our enormous discredit.
Miscredit, exactly. Well, going back to Rosicrucianism, I have read in several stories, let's put them like that the transition, now talking about Masonry, from operative to speculative Masonry, was also partly triggered by the appearance of Rosicrucianism. So I have a bit of a hard time to link those two things. Did you know that? Do you know that argument? And if so, would you support it, and for what reason?
There's something in it was originally a German historian, Buhler, if I remember right, first writes this in the early 1800s. It's repeated. I think Shelley in England repeats it.
Right.
And of course, the writer of the Opium Eater, Diary of an Opium Eater, I forget the author. He repeats it that it's the arrival of Rosicrucianism that inspires Robert Flood, and that somehow Robert Flood influences the development of Masonry.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So through that path, it would have occurred, if so.
Yes, I don't believe that. I don't think quite that way. I think my guess is from the limited and ambiguous evidence. I think Flood was involved with the London Company of Masons at some point. I think this thing about the exceptional ceremony that we have evidence for from 1614 is important. Something was going on in the London Company of Masons for the upper leadership of it, the Master Masons of London.
Right.
And people they brought in, that seems to suggest that there was some kind of esoteric element coming in for those who could afford it. Top. But I really think that this whole thing about a translation to speculative masonry is a fake. Because I don't think it did transform into speculative masonry. I think it went backwards. I think the spiritual and philosophical masonry was already present to the leadership of the London Company of Freemasons, later renamed the London Company of Masons. It was already there. Otherwise, I don't think people like Elias Ashmole would have been very interested in it.
Yeah, that's a good argument, yes.
And we should never underestimate the fact that the Master Masons of England, medieval period, and in the Stuart and Tudor period, were some of the richest men and most educated men in the country. And even in the Middle Ages, as we call them, they had access to the monastic library. So I think your mate didn't need to be told he had to be speculative. This is a very late 18th, 19th century idea. that a master mason was a worker, was a manual laborer, and it needed architects to make the difference. The master mason was an architect. He was architect, and he could build, unlike many of our architects today who control it. But they cannot build, and they're absolutely hopeless. They have to take advice on how to drain a building, and provide adequate physical, We had in England the development in the 19th century of the Royal Institute of British Architects, RIBA. If you want to be an architect in this country now, you have to be part of that. But what you don't have to be is a builder. I've had quite a lot of experience of dealing with both, and I'd much rather deal with a builder. The more inspired builders are natural, more inspired, not all, absolutely, but they actually love a challenge, a practical challenge. Your architect generally, I'm generalizing, like theoretical challenges. Anyway, we're talking about the development. Get to the point. We're talking about the development of practical masonry. I think the denigration of the old Masonic order in London was due to the changeover from the Stuarts to the Whig, to the Hanoverian dynasty. We find that all the people who were pushing for this so-called Grand Lodge, and there's some mystery there. Clearly, documents have been destroyed, absolutely clear. And what we've got is a takeover of a struggling organization, the conditions of building in the early 18th century. There was a great growth of building, obviously, after the Great Fire of London.
A Great Fire, yeah.
And so Masons came to the fore. We have the account of Christopher Wren, who was a pencil architect, not a builder, a pencil architect, a very brilliant one, being brought into the colony, which biographers tend to denigrate as irrelevant. It's not irrelevant. They recognize somebody that they needed in their organization. And unfortunately, you then have this development in 1716, at the meeting in the pub in London, where they decide to have, so the story goes, a Grand Lodge next year.
Yeah.
And who are leading this? It's all the pro-Hanoverian Whigs. Why are they taking this organization over? I personally believe, we can't prove it, it's because it was full of old Tories. And the old Tories, we're talking just after the first Jacobite rebellion of 1715, old Tories had an affection for a Catholic England. Not necessarily Roman Catholic, but a Catholic England. They didn't want the Protestants taking over, and they didn't want the rationalists taking over. There's a more traditional, old-fashioned, old England thing going on here. You get hints of this in London today if you know where to go.
Okay.
And it's the Hanoverians taking over, and their messiah is Isaac Newton, which is true. That Masonry should be about a Newtonian universe, an ordered universe. There are books written at the time, I forget the name of the main one, but basically they likened the Hanoverian dynasty to the Newtonian universe. It's harmonious. This is the word, harmony. Let launch. It's a harmonious universe which accepts all the different beliefs in it, doesn't allow any of them to take control. In other words, it's a Hanoverian settlement, which is a very attractive thing, unless you happen to know about the older thing. And it's the old Masonry is just, I don't know what happens to it particularly. You have a choice by 1717 to 1721 whether you join the new order or not. Now, we know that some of the people didn't. And you have the idea of the John Masons, the St. John's Mason. It's all in my book on Freemasonry, the reality.
The reality, exactly.
But so now I don't think this was speculative. The word speculative at the time anyway meant using a mirror.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
It doesn't really tell you anything.
It's a new term as well.
And it's obvious, and it's very interesting ideologically, because when Masonry spreads to Germany, to Hamburg, and to Paris, they immediately start working on their own idea of what speculative Masonry is. And of course, German and French Masonry and Dutch Masonry immediately wants to identify with the Hermetic current. Yeah. And because of the class issue, they bring the chivalry and the Templars and all that stuff.
Sure.
And it was much more free about upward mobility in classes. France isn't Germany.
Yeah.
So by bringing the chivalry aspect in and the knight, you maintain the classes.
Absolutely. But there we are also in a time, I believe, when Rosicrucianism as such entered Masonry, because that was, of course, not part of that time we were just talking about. It came in later.
Into Masonry, yes and no. I mean, obviously, you could say the Royal Arch ritual, it seems to be inspired by aspects of the Father and so on.
Yeah.
And obviously, you then have, in France, the Illuminism, and there's an amalgam of Rosicrucianists, a new Golden Rosenkreuz, obviously, in Germany.
Yeah.
That's very late, isn't it? I mean,
that is very late, yeah.
Century, yeah.
And the real Rosicrucianism.
It's not real Rosicrucianism. It's we call it neo-Rosicrucianism.
Yeah, sure. And it's that those Rosicrucian degrees, as they are called, like in the ancient accepted rite, for example, or in other degrees, they came in, as you say, Franken in the late 18th century, early 19th, even 1802 or so.
It's a romantic movement, isn't it? But it's also based on some very, very, how can I say, naive views about alchemy.
In what respect?
If you wanted to talk about my book, came out this year on the first alchemists.
Yes, we should.
Clearly, they didn't understand. I mean, where do we begin? The reason I wrote the first alchemist was to say, well, what is alchemy? What was it to begin with? At the period of its formation as a separate science, or what's called the most noble and holy art, is how it's described in the 4th century. How did that become the philosopher's stone and all that? And there's obviously you get periodic revivals of alchemy historically. There's one in the 15th century, 16th century is probably the biggest revival ever. And then there's a 17th century revival, and then in the 18th century, when a lot of the impetus of chemistry has gone into what we'd now call scientific chemistry, to end up with a romantic Masonic chemistry, which is perfectly valid interpretation that you can regard the soul and the human mind as chemical reactions.
That's the Atenor and
capable of being transformed through the presence of a catalyst.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, I cut you.
Yes.
Okay. But in Masonry, just to finish that chapter, maybe nowadays we find a kind of a revival of those esoteric currents, especially in North America, maybe even more than in other places, not so much in England probably, partly also on the European continent. Is that still just a romanticizing like it was in the 19th or 18th century with Rosicrucianism? Is this something serious where you see that Masonry might be going a little bit back more to its original roots, the ones that you just mentioned, which are really early roots? Or is that just romantic again? And
I'd never say just romantic in the sense I'm not as romantic as I was, and I was very romantic.
Okay.
And I sometimes, I'd rather be very romantic than anything else. Really, bitterness that dulls that youthful aspiration for the star or the rock, as I put it in my poem too.
Your poem we heard, yeah.
But
yeah.
the rock is what I'm going to die with. I'm not going to die with a bunch of ideas. I will cling to the rock and aim for the star right to the end. So if somebody says it's just romanticism, I say, that's what Clark Gable get Marilyn Monroe to look at the end of The Misfits, just before both of them were dead. I think romanticism is terribly important, and I would rather live in a world of romantics. I remember Alistair Crowley wrote in a letter once to one of his acolytes, I think it was Gerald York, who I really believe that if people had the mentality of Walter Scott and the romantic novels, it would be a better world. And he missed it. And
Right.
I think we're suffering from realism, which is,
Can you expand on that?
well, in many ways I could expand on it. I think first of all, realism is now associated with visual explicitness, not in depth of understanding.
Right.
What I think we are becoming tortured by the opaque appearance of things and frightened by images. And the first principle of the prophetic gospel in the so-called Old Testament Jewish scripture is do not believe in images. But we have become utterly slaves to image, which is what Andy Warhol was making very clear with his fake icons. He knew that fake icons, these were opaque versions of holy images. These movie stars are not ways to heaven. They are not the lens through which you glimpse eternity. They merely reflect back your own vanity. And that's what he was doing with those screen prints of the movie stars. Not that he adored Elizabeth Taylor and Marilyn as individuals and as people, but he also recognized that images were being commercialized and repeated to the point of being meaningless. The people were meaningless. He thought the people's meaning was being covered up by the image. Now, the worship of images, the primary sin of Hermeticism also, which in Hermetic writings is called worship of the body, which is the number one sin. In other words, worship of the appearance. And you talk about what I mean. What I mean is my attack on realism is it's not realism.
Right.
The realism goes much, 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 much deeper. And people are being manipulated by images. And even our children at school has been doing tests recently. They're being more attracted to books of very short length, but with high visual impact. So the children are being brainwashed into image worship. And this is across our culture. These are transnational problems. These are problems in China, Russia, Austria, Britain, France, everywhere. And then this is one of the tragedies of the modern world. Is the modern world is beset by common pansophical problems. Well, and yet we are aiming all our venom and our hatred on each other. And yet we're all basic issues of a culture that's gone wrong.
Some say through the principles that we can read in Pharma or in other Rosicrucian writings, this, exactly what you're just saying now, hatred and this splitting of the world in a way, could be overcome by the virtues that are mentioned there.
It cannot happen that way because we know that evil exists. And if you read André or any of the great spiritual writers, you never underestimate evil. Jakob Burma tries to deal with it by talking about the wrath of God, the hell is just the other side of the love, and somehow they're coming together creates the spark of dynamic existence, but which will eventually resolve. I find this naive. I think Burma's universe is simply a projection of human nature. Wrath and love are just the contrary aspects of human beings. Would probably argue that humanity is the reflection of God's own dynamic contradiction. Well, that doesn't help me at all. I think we help people who like Burma in the 17th century. Burma was an important figure in all this. You talk in Rosicrucianism today, most neo-Rosicrucianism has absorbed more Jakob Burma than it has Andrei. I think...
Yeah, that's true.
I think they should get into Andrei and leave Burma for those people who think they understand.
You like Andrei, don't you?
I think he's a straightforward truth. He's perceptive. He's cynical. The reading of it, it's so cynical. But it's the right kind of cynicism. It's the cynicism of one of Britain's greatest ever comics, Peter Cook. It's the kind of cynicism which reveals the startling truth.
Right.
It's not just world-weary dipping of things. Just It's caustic. I mean, I think there's a lot of cynicism in the New Testament, in Jesus' sayings as well.
Okay.
A lot there. That's a tiredness with the fakery of people and the hypocrisy.
Do you have an example of that?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have an example?
Well, when I thought you were going to ask that, and I thought that anything that came to my head was when he says, "Render unto things." Strikes me an arch, at least ironic, but probably cynical comment.
Right. Interesting.
Render unto things. Give me a coin. Whose face is on the coin? It says, "Well, yes, yes." It seems to me to be a very, very coarse and cynical remark. Not at all justification for the state that Luther thought it was. I think Luther was totally wrong. Well, his opposition to the peasants' revolt said everything that Luther lived in a thinking man's world. It's like Plato's heaven is a heaven for intellectuals. Luther's heaven is heaven for Asians. I'm interested in the heaven that is heaven, full stop.
For whom? For everyone.
Whoever understands what heaven is.
Yeah. So talking about cynicism, we in the two last chapters of the Invisible Book, of the book on Rosicrucianism, the first of the before last is called Age of Progress. Let me just say that really correctly. I have to switch image here. Yes, the Age of Progress. I'm right. And then the last chapter, when you started talking more or less about the 20th century, is the Age of Insanity. Right. So could you explain, within the frame of Rosicrucianism, are we switching from progress to insanity?
Well, the Age of Progress is probably the more cynical comment.
Probably.
This is a reference to the naivety of industrial mechanistic progress, so-called 19th century. There was a lot of progress here and there, but there was a lot of retrogression as well.
Brilliant.
My tongue in my when I say the age. As for the Age of Insanity, well, I think the whole thing starts to come apart. I think it starts to split apart in the 20th century. And I think a lot of the neo-Gnostic developments are insane. Right. I mean, in the classic, sanity means healthy. insane, healthy, and to be clean-minded. And I think a lot of the concepts, it's actually worse now than when I wrote the book, which is this conspiracy theory thing.
Right.
Looking for ulterior powers. Well, I can only say to that, there have always been ulterior powers and there has always been conspiracies. Conspiracy means to whisper. It means you don't want people to know what you're doing. Well, has any organization ever functioned without conspiracy? The problem is that these insights into human duplicity are generalized to suggest a kind of cosmic lie that's being told. That's quite similar to the some of the radical Gnostics, which is you have one overall explanation of everything. Right. In the case of the radical Gnostics, I do distinguish less radicals. We're living in the Archon's universe, governed by a false god, and in which the soul imprisoned. Now that's obviously has come alive again in the modern world in the idea of the Matrix, that there's fundamental falsity, a counterfeit universe that human beings are imprisoned in, where everything is twisted. Once you accept that mythology of the counterfeit universe in which you are embedded, it seems to me that you lose sanity. You've lost health of mind, because you will never know in that situation where truth lies. And you're then in a kind of hellish chaos. And it's my faith, a fundamental faith that actually things ain't quite like that, protects me from these. I've known several people I know, some quite close to me, who accepted the idea of the conspiracy, the financial, some vast conspiracy. I think there are all sorts of conspiracies going on. There always have. And that's why we need the voice of truth. But when you get people who won't listen to plain and well-researched truths and prefer the big explanation, and when you've got people of limited education having access to these ideas, you have really got, and you're developing a kind of universal asylum. Of people who are totally incapable of making sensible judgments. And in an era of the spread of democracy, where these people's opinions matter, we're in Scheisserstrasse.
Well, a German word on this podcast. Wow. Yeah. Well. You are really, to me, one of the last polymaths, in that sense. You just mentioned it yourself. You were writing about Gnosis, about Rosicrucianism, but also about the 60s and the time when you grew up and all that, what that meant sociologically. You wrote about 4 volumes, I believe, on Alistair Crowley in detail. 6. Oh my goodness, I miscounted. I have them all back on the shelf, but I counted wrong. Anyway, about almost everything in that field. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. You don't have to answer it if you don't want to, but I just wonder, as a polymath that you are you also a practitioner in the sense of magic and occultism?
I'm God's secret weapon.
Okay. We'll leave it like that. Very good. Very good answer. I knew it would be something special, that answer.
If you're smart, you'll take that with the pinch of salt.
Yeah, absolutely.
How can one know? Really know what one's place in the universe is if magic, if we accept the definition of causing changes in the universe,
if you will. Yeah.
well, if that's the definition, if that's the practice, do I do rituals? Well, it depends what you mean by a ritual, doesn't it? I mean, if you do something with a purpose, I clean my teeth as a ritual. And I'm joking.
Yeah.
I know.
I'm laughing, but I know because it's true. Yeah.
You can turn everything into a ritual. When I'm stirring rice, I have the odd tip from Rudolf Steiner about what the vortex you create in the rice in the saucepan.
Right.
It's ritual. It really depends how much of the true mind you bring to what you're doing.
Yeah.
But the notion of the magician is capable of anything is absolutely true in theory, but in practice, you've got to accept you're up against all the time a tremendous amount of resistance, and no thought projected for your mind is allowed a kind of complete run to its proper end. It's great. You are the modern world, particularly. It's nothing but interference.
Yeah.
And the whole point about Crowley's theory of do what thou wilt is it's based on reducing interference. You could do what thou wilt doesn't mean an awful lot more than mind your own business. And nowadays we're living in a world where people will not mind their own business. They're forever. My father used to say, lovely line, he used to say, people with no business of their own are forever minding somebody else's.
Yeah. Yeah.
What is a journalist? A minder of other people's business. What is a politician but a minder of other people's business? Everybody is interfering in other people's lives. I do not want to know what you earn. I don't want to know where you live. I don't, as my grandfather used to say, as long as it doesn't frighten the horses, you what thou wilt, mate. You find your own path. Stop interfering.
Yeah. Yeah.
Magic of the individual could be much more effective if people didn't continually interfere. An enlightened mind will produce enlightened results.
Definitely.
The scale of those results will depend on the existence of other enlightened minds.
Right.
Where Jesus said, where 2 or 3 are gathered together, there I shall be. So
There we are.
if you said to him, well, what if there were 5 and 6? Would that be better? I'm sure he'd say 5 and 6 may do twice what 2 and 3 could do. But if the 5 and 6 are not as tuned in as 2 and 3, get rid of them.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. Well, I cut you a little bit earlier, but now we're coming towards the end of this talk, I'm afraid. Yeah, I do much better. Well, let's not wait for another 3 years. That's the only solution for this. But you mentioned your next upcoming book. So say again, and maybe you have some other things in the back of your mind you want to share with our people here.
Well, the next book to come out early next year is, I think, the most important academic level work I've done. And it may be important spiritually to a degree as well. But the title that the publisher are happy with is The Books of Enoch Revealed. I can't remember anymore what my original title was, but it wasn't there. But Books of Enoch Revealed. Yes, I don't know how much you know about the Book of Enoch. I think it's the most influential book of all time.
I know a bit from what you wrote in your book on Enoch.
The new book goes into the entire history of this book, and every scholar who's studied it at a high level is referenced. Sounds boring, but I hope what I'm trying to. I'm for the first time ever bringing together all the greatest scholarship right through since the late antiquity. Right in the in Islam and Judaism and in Christianity on the books. And it's an incredible story. And it has big implications for Christian understanding of Christian origins, but also on our understanding of prophecy in general.
Okay.
I think it's a bloody important work.
Good. When is it due? Do you have a date?
I think they said February.
Okay, well, that's close.
Very close.
Very good. And is there any other plans behind that?
What do you mean, other books or what?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I've already finished the one for that after. I finished it 5 months early. I wanted to record an album of music between now and Christmas, which I've started
Right.
behind me.
Yeah, I see the guitar and everything.
So there's that. So yeah, but I think the book is called Heaven: The History. I wanted to call it Heaven: The Book. American audiences might think I was trying to compete with the Bible. Because it's a word.
Hold the breath. Well, what did you say? You were God's what? Good. Yeah, that's very good. Yeah.
Well done. Yeah.
Well, as long as it doesn't frighten the horses, it will be.
Well, I think that's right. Yeah, Heaven: The History is the first ever world global review ideas and experiences of heaven in every culture, and I mean every. I go from Eskimo, North American, South American, African, Far East, Japanese, Chinese, Indian, Buddhist, Hindu, Christian, Islamic. All of the ideas of heaven, and it's been a revelation because, as you would expect, in all sorts of ways, i.e., what people have in common, in not commonality, but also what the differences are, and you see where the greatest dynamic thought has been given to this idea of a heaven, and obviously. So I think it'll be more useful to people than reading Dante's Inferno.
Okay. Well, isn't that a good final sentence?
If you say so.
Well, Toby, thank you so much for this really inspiring talk. And as I said, I really do hope we will not wait for another 3 years for another one. And well, thanks for your time, and thanks for all of that you were telling us and sharing with us.
Oh, it's a privilege to be asked, especially I do, Rudolf.
Oh my goodness.
Always enjoyed your stuff more than anybody.
Thanks so much.
No offense to anybody else, but you've got a wonderful understanding.
That's very kind. Thank you, and have a good rest of the day.
Dankeschön.
So I do hope you all enjoyed this first episode, the episode number 1 of the Pansophers podcast. If you haven't already done so, please go to episode 0. We had an episode 0 3 weeks ago, who introduces you the team of Pansophers and our ideas and why we're all doing that. It's really interesting. It's been an interesting talk. So if you have missed that, please do go on all the usual outlets for podcasts or on pansophers.com/podcast or on thoughthermes.com. You can find us everywhere there. And, I thank Tobias for being with me here today. And, well, what a nice thing he said at the end of the interview. I'm still blushing from it. Our program announcement now. I told you I will do that at the end of the show, and I will, every time we do a show, announce the next episodes in that case too. Next Pansophers episode is due in 2 weeks on October the 27th. And that will be a talk with somebody who was mentioned actually in today's episode, in today's interview, Christopher McIntosh, who also wrote very interesting books about Rosicrucianism, about Eliphas Levi, many things, topic. We're going to talk mainly, because that's also related to the Pansophers in a way, about his book Occult Germany, but not exclusively. We will, of course, also talk about other topics and that he treated and about himself. So Christopher McIntosh in 2 weeks, but in between there is an episode of Thoth Hermes you can go and listen to. Also, I mentioned that little series, not such a little series, full year series on science and occultism, which I present with my co-host Karin. And next week, in fact, it's the first of those series that will be presented in an interview with Jeffrey Kripal. And we are going to talk about what we do to accept the impossible. So, next Sunday, Thoth Hermes, in 2 weeks, Pansophers. You got a lot to listen to, and I'm looking forward to having you back again on these waves here on pansophers.com/podcast, on thothhermes.com, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. And for the time being, as you're used to hear from me, take care, stay tuned. Hear you soon.